There will be several lectures on methodology in the course of this week. This will be the first, so certain topics will probably reappear and we dealt with more extensively than I'm able to do right now. The question that I want to address in this talk is the question, what is the status of economic propositions? Is economics an axiomatic deductive science, or is it what we call an empirical science? Or to phrase it a little bit differently, are the propositions of economics logically derived from some firmly established starting points, and hence, provided that no logical flaw is made, absolutely true, or as Mises says, apodictically true, or are economic propositions hypothetical propositions that require ongoing empirical testing? And contrary to widespread beliefs, these questions, these fundamental methodological questions, are of extreme importance. They are not trivial, but have dramatic consequences insofar as one will proceed in a very different way doing economics depending on how one answers this question that I just put in front of you. And I hope that this also will become clear how dramatic the consequences are that follow from the answer that you give to this question. When we look at the present situation, then we can say that all economists, except the Austrians, believe that economics is an empirical science requiring continual testing of its proposition. Now, to say this does not mean that all economists actually practice what they preach. As a matter of fact, I would say that the better among the non-Austrian economists typically do not practice what they preach. But their mediocre followers typically do, with important consequences. Now, while the Austrians are outsiders today, they actually represent what used to be the mainstream position. When we look at the history of economic thought, then we can roughly say that until the early 50s, the position that the Austrians hold, that economics is an axiomatic deductive science, was the position held by the majority of economists, and the most important book in this area was a book by Lionel Robbins on the nature and significance of economic science. This book is still in print. I highly recommend it. And in this book, Lionel Robbins presents a position that is very similar to the position that is also represented and presented by Ludwig von Mises, and this is not an accident, because Lionel Robbins was in some sense a student of Ludwig von Mises. He visited him frequently in Vienna, and if you look through the index of Robbins' book, then you will find that there is no name that appears more frequently than the name of of Mises. And we can say in addition that in the 19th century most major economists, let's say people like Say and Senior and Cairns, were also proponents of the idea that economic propositions are non-hypothetical propositions that do not require any empirical testing. Interestingly, even John Maynard Keynes did not believe that economics was a discipline that required continuous testing of its proposition, but was some sort of deductive, axiomatic deductive discipline. You will find in Keynes, for instance, in his main work, very critical, almost nasty remarks about mathematical economics and econometric studies. Now, the adoption of this new view that economics is an empirical science is due to the influence of modern positivism, or also sometimes called of logical empiricism. And this positivism or logical empiricism is the heir of classical empiricism as represented, for instance, by Hume and Locke. This logical positivism was propagated first in particular by the so-called Vienna Circle, or at its own time it was called the Schlick-Kreis, named after Moritz Schlick, its founder, a philosophy professor at Vienna. Mises was from the very beginning familiar with this Schlick-Kreis. They met at the same period of time as Mises had his famous Mises Circle in Vienna. Actually, the Schlick Circle was smaller in size than the Mises Circle, and Mises knew in particular about this circle because his own brother, Richard von Mises, was a member or a close associate of this circle in Vienna. Other members, some famous names of this Vienna circle were Rudolf Carnap, Hans Reichenbach, Gustav Hempel, Otto Neurath, and also on the fringe of that circle, Karl Popper, who called his version of the logical, of the Positivist Creed, who called his version critical rationalism, but in a way this is a misleading term, similarly to the situation that we find in modern politics, when in America people call themselves liberals who would be called socialists in any other country except in the United States. So critical rationalism betrays, in a way, the real meaning of the philosophy proposed by Karl Popper. Now let me describe what this Positivist Creed is and amounts to, and I will take the Popper version of it. The basic convictions of the logical positivists are the following. The first is that there exist only two types of scientific propositions. The first one we call empirical propositions, and empirical propositions say something about the real world. And empirical propositions, according to the positivists, must be either verifiable by experience, or, as Popper would put it, they must be in principle falsifiable by experience. And experience can always be different from what one had experienced in the past. Or to put it differently, there is nothing about reality that we know with certainty. Every knowledge, all knowledge about reality is hypothetical knowledge. There exists no such thing as non-hypothetical statements that say something about real things. And the second type of legitimate scientific statements are what they call analytical statements. And analytical statements or propositions are propositions that are true by definition. Logic and mathematics, according to the positivists, are examples of analytical knowledge. They do not say anything about reality. They just define certain terms in terms of other terms. And I might add, according to the Positivist Creed, there exists no such thing as scientific statements about normative matters. There exists no such thing as a rational ethics. Normative propositions such as I advocate this or I like this are nothing more than matters of taste, matters of decisions that people make without any justification for it. The second creed of the positivists is that in all sciences we have the same structure of explanations, and explanations are structurally the same as predictions. All explanations have the form of if-then statements. If A is the case, then B will follow, or C will follow, or whatever. And these if-then statements are statements that refer to a class of events. They are statements like if A, then B, and A refers to all phenomena that are falling into the group or class of A, and B refers to a phenomenon that falls into the class of all phenomena like B. These hypotheses then can be either confirmed by experience. If we find A, and indeed A is accompanied by B, as we hypothesized, then we would say the hypothesis has been confirmed. And if we find an instance of A which is not followed by B, then we would say the hypothesis is falsified. But when it comes to the confirmation or the falsification of our hypothesis, it is important to note the following. A confirmation of a hypothesis does not mean that we have found this hypothesis to be true. All it means is, so far it has not been falsified, because it applies to a universal class of phenomena. So far we have not found an instance of A that was not accompanied by B, but we might well find that in the future. So it is just a temporary confirmation, not a verification, not an establishment of this hypothesis as being true. A falsification also does not definitely show that the relationship as it was hypothesized between A and B does not exist at all. All it shows is that the hypothesis as it was initially stated is not correct. There might well be a relationship between A and B as hypothesized, but only if we control for some third or fourth or fifth additional variable, for instance. So the falsification also never establishes once and for all that A and B are not related in the way that it was initially stipulated. It only shows that they are not quite related in the way it was initially assumed to be the case. And according to the positivists, or according to Popper in particular, scientific progress then takes place through falsifications of hypotheses. They lead to a revision of the hypothesis, then we test that one, and that might lead to revisions, and thereby we gradually march forward and into the light. And maybe a third central tenet of the Positivist Creed is the following: definitions can be of only two kinds. Definitions are either ostensive definitions, that is, I point to something and say, this is a tree, or this is a pig. Or they are stipulative definitions, like bachelor means unmarried men. That is, where things are defined in terms of other words. But there exists no such thing, according to the positivists, as real definitions. That is, definitions that capture, so to speak, the essence of a thing. You have heard, I'm sure, in the previous lecture that definitions do play a role in Austrian economics. Austrian economics begins with the axiom that humans act, and then a description of what an action is. Intentional pursuit of ends with scarce means. The Austrians would claim this is a correct definition of what an action is. According to the positivist, no such thing is possible. Only stipulative things or ostensive things, ostensive definitions, are legitimate definitions. Now, before I come to the refutation of the Positivist Creed, I want to make you aware of some important implications that follow once you adopt this view. The first one is, of course, that the positivists are moral relativists. There is no such thing as rational ethics. That might strike you as being of less importance, but I would think this position, to take a position of moral relativism, is also a moral position. And one might have doubt about it as soon as one realizes that moral relativism is also a moral stand. That is, moral decisions are arbitrary decisions. Besides the relativistic implications for ethics, the Positivist Creed leads to what one might call a philosophy of social engineering, or to the attitude that everything is possible. Recall, we know nothing with certainty about the real world, and everything can and must be tried out, provided only that one keeps an open mind. That is, provided only one is willing to say at some point, what I had hypothesized is now falsified by experience. Popper has called his own social philosophy the philosophy of piecemeal social engineering. Now let's take a look at some economic propositions and see how well this view that all propositions are hypothetical fits economic propositions. Consider the following statements. In every voluntary exchange, both exchange partners must expect to benefit from the exchange, otherwise they would not engage in it. And both exchange partners must evaluate the goods or services that they exchange as having unequal value, such that whatever I surrender has in my eyes less value than whatever I acquire, and both exchange partners accordingly must have opposite preference orders or reverse preference orders. Whatever I prefer must be the good that is considered to be of lesser importance by the other person. When I exchange $1 for a newspaper, I must prefer the newspaper over the dollar, and the newspaper vendor must prefer the dollar over the newspaper. Is this a hypothetical statement, or is this a statement that can be recognized as being true without requiring any type of test? Take another example. Let's say we increase the minimum wage in the United States under the present circumstances to $1,000 an hour. And we enforce this to the hilt. Then, when we predict that unemployment will result, or dramatic unemployment will result, this, according to the positivist, is just an hypothesis. According to the Austrians, it would be something that we can recognize as being necessarily true. Or take another example. If we increase the money supply, we double or triple the amount of money in existence, what will happen to the prosperity in society? You can hypothesize that Austrians would predict in this case wealth in society will not increase. All that will happen is the general price level will rise, and there will be a redistribution of income, but the overall wealth in society will not be changed. Just prices rise. According to the positivists, this is just a hypothesis. Third example, under socialism, when all factors of production are owned by the government, then there exists no prices for factors of production, and because no prices for factors of production exist, we cannot compare input and output prices. That is, we cannot determine whether we produced efficiently or inefficiently. Economic calculation is impossible under socialism. It is impossible to determine whether we produced wastefully or not wastefully. Is that a hypothesis, or is that a statement that we can recognize as necessarily true about socialism? Now, the first impression I would take is that these statements that I just presented, minimum wages will lead to unemployment, economic calculation under socialism is impossible, an increase in the money supply cannot increase the general welfare, and voluntary exchanges are mutually beneficial, that these statements are statements that say something about the real world as it is, about real phenomena, and at the same time they are non-hypothetical. They are not statements that we would regard as statements that require any type of testing. Yet according to positivism, this cannot be the case. They must be hypotheses. But if they are hypotheses, then you can say the opposite of these statements, and you do not say patent nonsense. That is, it would be possible to say every voluntary exchange harms both parties involved in it. That is just as legitimate a hypothesis as the other one. Or you can say economic calculation under socialism is possible. That's also a hypothesis. Or you can say increasing the minimum wage to $10,000 an hour will increase employment. That is not on the face of it, so to speak, a silly, stupid statement. It is just as legitimate a hypothesis as the opposite one. And if it is a legitimate hypothesis, and the statements that I gave you before are also only hypotheses and are not statements that we can recognize as being necessarily true, then there exists only one way to find out whether we are right or wrong, and that is by trying it out. So the positivists would then say we have to introduce a minimum wage of whatever $1,000 an hour and then see what happens. You realize that the Austrians would say, we don't need to try that out. We can recognize from the very beginning what the results will be. If it is just an hypothesis that an increase in the money supply will not increase the general standard of living, then we have to try it out. If somebody would say, oh, I think it will increase the general standard of living, so let's triple the money supply. We have to try it out and then see what the results are. With socialism, the same thing. Austrians would say, because we can recognize that from the outset as a necessary truth, that if factors of production are not privately owned, no factor prices exist, and accordingly no economic calculation is possible. For if this is just a hypothesis, then we have to try out socialism first before we know what the answer to this riddle is. And now assume that the experiment doesn't go as we expected it to go. That is to say, we find out that general standards of living did not increase after increasing the money supply. That indeed unemployment resulted while we predicted more employment would result from a minimum wage of $1,000 an hour. Now, recall what I said, a falsification does not mean that the initial hypothesis must be fundamentally wrong. It only means the way we formulated it the first time, there must be something wrong about it. But we can stipulate, or we can hypothesize that we only need to control for a few additional variables, and then it will turn out that indeed the results will be as we predicted them. For instance, let's say we try out socialism and find out that it causes misery. Then we can say, that is probably only due to the fact that the wrong leader was in charge of implementing the program. So it might be because of Stalin it didn't work. But if Trotsky would be in charge, maybe it would work. So we just change the leaders. And if that still doesn't work, then we can come up with another excuse. Oh, what we forgot to control was, of course, the weather. It works, of course, only in good seasons. The sun shines for a long time, but not when it rains a lot. So we have to control that. And then when the results are still not coming in as we predicted them, and we find a third or fourth or fifth excuse and control that variable. That is, there is never any point where we definitely come to the conclusion something is really fundamentally and intrinsically and essentially wrong with our ideas. We can always go on and on and on. And I do not need to tell you that this is, of course, how most of the positivists in the social sciences typically operate with their pet ideas. Whenever they do not work, they find an excuse why they don't work, and then try the next ridiculous thing on us. Now I come to a refutation. So far I have tried to make things only plausible to you. Now I want to come to a more rigorous refutation of the Positivist Creed. And to do this, I will return to the three basic tenets that I mentioned before and employ what is called a self-referential argument. That is, I want to apply the positivistic creed to itself. Now recall, the first statement was all statements are either empirical statements or they are analytical statements. And the question that we have to raise now is, what is the status of this distinction? Is this distinction, all statements are empirical or they are analytical, is this itself empirical? If it is empirical, then we would say it's just a hypothesis. So what? I can just propose exactly the opposite hypothesis. That is not a reason to believe in this distinction if it is just hypothetical. Or it is just analytical. They simply define. Okay, I define that statements are of this kind or of that kind. Then we can say, and definitions, as you recall, contain no information about reality. Then we can say, so what? I mean, I can define anything any way I want. I can also define it exactly the other way around. Again, you have not given me any reason for making this distinction the way you make it. So there is no epistemology at all. But if you take then the third possible way out, that is to say, now this statement that there are only empirical and analytical statement is itself a statement that is non-hypothetical and saying something about the real world, then of course your entire position becomes inconsistent. That is, then you contradict yourself. And this is of course precisely the position that the Austrians take. Statements of that kind, this distinction, is itself non-hypothetical and saying something true about real phenomena. That statements of this sort exist is precisely the position that Austrians hold. We can do the same exercise with all explanations have the same form of predictions if A then B. What is the status of this explanation of explanations? Is this explanation of what an explanation is an empirical statement, hypothetical statement? Again, then we say, so what? Or is an analytical statement? And the answer is again, so what? Or, and that is of course then leading again to a contradiction, they must say, no, this explanation of what an explanation is a non-hypothetical statement that says something about real phenomena. That is, we have statements of the kind that according to positivists do not exist at all. Third example, with the definitions. So what is the status of the statement that all definitions are either stipulative definitions or they are ostensive definitions. Is this an ostensive definition or is this a stipulative definition? And the answer is, of course, clearly it is neither. If it has any persuasive power, this definition of what definitions are must claim to be a real definition. That is, saying something non-hypothetically true about real existing phenomena. Now in the second, so we see the position of the logical positivist is contradictory, leads to contradictions. Now in the next step I want to show that whatever one might think about the applicability of the falsificationist program in the natural sciences, it certainly cannot be thought to be applicable in the social sciences or in the sciences of human action. And I want to establish, so to speak, two claims that there exists a difference between the natural sciences and the social sciences, and secondly, that there exist two types within the social sciences. One type that we would call theory, or Austrians would call it praxeology, and another branch in the social sciences which we refer to as history, insofar as the past is concerned, and entrepreneurship or speculative predicting insofar as future events are concerned. I want to show the inapplicability of the falsificationist program to the social sciences, to the sciences of human action, also via a self-referential argument. But in the first step of this argument, I want to briefly recapitulate, so to speak, in which way the positivists propose to proceed as a scholar, as a scientist. What they propose, for instance, to do is something like this. Here we have what is a simple regression equation. Y is our dependent variable. We want to explain that. And A and B are constants, and X is the variable through which we want to explain, is the independent variable by which we want to explain our dependent variable Y, and E is just an error term. So we just formulate this as a hypothesis. And then we collect data on Y and data on X. Yeah.
E is what?
An error term.
An error?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we collect data on Y and X, and we can either come to the conclusion that this hypothesis was confirmed, and then that would require, of course, further retests and so forth. Remember, confirmation does not mean verification. We have to go on. It might be false after all. Or we come to the result that this hypothesis is falsified. And if it is falsified, then we have to revise this hypothesis. And one possible revision would be this one, where we add a third, the second independent variable, z, to our equation. So we say first the falsification is due to the fact that z was not controlled for. As soon as we control z, then the relationship between x and y will appear as we initially as we initially thought it would. Now, ask yourself the following question. What is necessary for us to say when we get the same result the second time as the first time, that this is a confirmation? And what is necessary in order to say this is a falsification? We must make an important assumption in order to say this has been confirmed or this has been falsified. And to recognize what assumption we must make, ask yourself, why don't we just say when we get the second result that is the same as the first one, that the second instance of experience simply is a repetition of the first one. But it is not a confirmation. These things are just completely independent events, so to speak. We happen to observe one thing once, and then we observe the same thing again. It does not follow necessarily this is a confirmation. The same with falsification. If we observe in the second instance that the second instance does not turn out to be the same as the first one, we could also say, why don't we refer to this as a non-repetition? First it was this way, the second time it was that way. So big deal. What is necessary in order to lead us to say that there was something wrong with our first experience is that we must make the assumption, a non-empirical assumption, that is, that the nature of things doesn't change. That there are time-invariantly operating causes at work. That things are not the way that sometimes things work this way and sometimes they work in another way. We must make the assumption that over time the working of causes does not change. Only then can we say that the second instance is a confirmation or the second instance is a falsification of the first instance of experience. So the non-empirical assumption that we must make in order to say confirmed or falsified is there exist prediction constants. Without this assumption, you could neither say that there is a confirmation or a falsification of hypothesis. But then the question arises, and in the natural sciences, I do not doubt that we can just make this assumption that nature doesn't change. But can we make this assumption when it comes to human actions? That is the question. That is this assumption also true in the case of actions? And there, the answer is no. It is not possible to make this assumption when it comes to human actions. Why? Because human actions are influenced, all of them, by individual knowledge that people have about certain goals, available means, how we achieve our goals with means, and so forth. Now, imagine that Y does not refer to some natural phenomenon that we want to explain, but refers to an activity that a person engages in. We want to predict a certain choice, a certain action of a certain individual. Now look at the person who engages in this intellectual procedure. That is, look at the researcher himself who follows the Positivist Creed. That's how we do research. Okay. And what do you find when you look at this researcher? The Y is the behavior of the researcher that you want to explain. Now, what you find, of course, is that this researcher implicitly admits that he can, of course, learn. That is, he begins with a hypothesis, and then he learns this has been confirmed, this has been falsified, then he revises the hypothesis, and so forth. If he would not be of the opinion that he can learn, what is the purpose of engaging in this enterprise? And secondly, does the researcher know in advance that at the point where he formulates his first hypothesis, what and how he will learn? And the answer is, obviously he doesn't know what and how he will learn. Otherwise, why would he engage in this? He cannot predict the outcome of his tests before the outcomes are in. He cannot predict in which way it will be falsified and what his next hypothesis might be. Because if he could predict it, he would already be at that point. He would not have to formulate the first hypothesis at all. So what we can say is, as a result of his own conducting his research, his knowledge will continuously change. He will be continuously different. And accordingly, the actions that he performs, and again recall, actions are influenced by our knowledge, the choices that he makes will also be different depending on the outcome of his various tests that he makes. But he does not know in which way it will be different. Otherwise, again, what would be the purpose of engaging in all of this? Now, what do we then implicitly admit? What we implicitly admit is that there are no constants on the basis of which future actions, insofar as actions can be influenced by knowledge, could be predicted. The entire enterprise applied to actions is, so to speak, nonsense from the outset. And it is interesting to see that Popper at some point in a book on poverty of historicism sees this. There he says something to this effect: you can't know ahead of time, that is, before you actually have it, your own future states of knowledge. Only at the time when you have it, then you know what you know. But you cannot predict what your learning will be in the course of time, and what you will learn. That you can only say once you have reached the future points. And hence, because knowledge influences actions, we cannot predict future actions by scientific means. There do not exist these prediction constants. To conclude, insofar as specific knowledge influences our actions, the social sciences must be either reconstructive, that is, once we know what people know, then we can of course say something about it. But we cannot predict their future learning, what it will be like. So history can only be reconstructive, and does not equip us with any predictive tools or powers. Or, insofar as the future is concerned, predictions of human actions are speculative. That's an entrepreneurial activity. We might call it an art, but it is not a science. There are no formulas that we can formulate that people can learn how to predict their fellow man's behavior. In that case, we would not need any entrepreneurs anymore. Everybody could do it. It would be like machines. But secondly, also, what we have realized is that there does exist a priori knowledge of action as such. Namely, that there are no prediction constants on the basis of which we can predict the various choices that people make. That is, insofar as our actions cannot be influenced by knowledge, we have certain knowledge about this aspect. Insofar our actions can be influenced by changes in knowledge, all we can do is engage in reconstructive history or in speculative predictions. Let me just try to illustrate this by using one of the most fundamental laws of economics. That is the law of marginal utility. The law of marginal utility states that as the supply of a homogeneous good increases, the marginal utility decreases, and vice versa. As the supply of a homogeneous good decreases, the marginal utility increases. Homogeneous goods are goods, each unit of which are regarded by an actor as having equal serviceability. That is, each unit is thought of as being capable of bringing about the same sort of satisfaction that any other unit of the good can do. Now, how do we explain this law? This law is not a psychological law. This is a praxeological law. In most textbooks, of course, present it as a psychological law, which is a major mistake. You can see that this law can be logically deduced, requiring no testing whatsoever. The first unit of a good will always be employed in order to satisfy the most highly ranking goal of all goals that can be satisfied with a unit of this good. The second unit will always be employed in order to satisfy the second most highly ranking goal of all goals that can be satisfied with a unit of this good. The third will be used in order to satisfy the third most highly ranking goal, and so forth. Now, this statement does not say what your most highly ranking goals are. That is, I'm not claiming by knowing this that I know anything about what your actual choices will be. What you do with the first orange might be something entirely different from what your neighbor does, or what I will do with the first orange. And what you will do with the first orange might change in the course of time, because you might learn additional things that can be done with oranges that you did not know until today. So no prediction at all is possible of actual choices influenced by our knowledge that we have. But for everyone, I can say with absolute confidence that even though I have not the faintest idea what your most highly ranking goal is, how the first orange will be used, I can say that you will use the first orange in order to satisfy your most highly ranking desire. And you will do the same, even though I do not know anything about what that most highly ranking desire will be. And I can say the same about me. I will use the first orange also to satisfy my most highly ranking desire, even though what this most highly ranking goal might be might change in the course of time in a way that I cannot predict myself. So we have, on the one hand, a statement that's a priori true about action as such. And at the same time, we have to admit that when it comes to any concrete choices, there's no scientific way of doing it at all. We cannot formulate any type of laws and proceed along the lines that the positivists tell us to proceed in that area. Let me end by explaining briefly how we use these praxeological insights, insights that are universally true about any action of any person as incorporated in the law of marginal utility, how that helps us explain, for instance, the shape of an individual demand curve. You know that we have these demand curves with prices and quantities on the two axes, and we draw a demand curve somehow like this. Why do we draw it like this? And is this a precise way of going about our business? Now the first point is, we can deduce this shape, this general shape, from the law of marginal utility, which we can understand as being logically correct. If we exchange, whatever, oranges for apples, then our supply of one good increases, say supply of oranges increases as we spend more money on oranges, accordingly the marginal utility of oranges goes down. And as we spend more and more money on oranges, our supply of money dwindles and the marginal utility of a unit of money increases. This explains why the curve is downward sloping and to the right. It explains, for instance, why there can be no vertical stretches on the demand curve. A vertical stretch on the demand curve would indicate that the law of marginal utility does not hold. An additional unit has the same utility for us as the previous unit had, which cannot be the case. It explains why there can be no upward stretch on the demand curve. That would mean an additional unit has even higher utility than the previous unit, and explains why there cannot be any backward stretches either. What the law of marginal utility does not say is, of course, that this individual demand curve must be a straight line. As a matter of fact, it can have all sorts of forms. It can look like this. It can be a jagged line like this. All it must do, it must represent what the law of marginal utility tells us is the case, namely that it must be downward falling and to the right. And all sorts of curves, of course, fulfill this requirement. That we use straight lines is just a simplification. That is, as soon as we start doing geometry on the blackboard, we are not more precise than the law of marginal utility. In a way, we are less precise. We are making simplifying assumptions that are not inherent in the law of marginal utility, which we can establish through plain logical reasoning. With that, I end my speech now. Thank you for your attention.